All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Panelists. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and Associate Provost for Global Affairs here at Northwestern University. We're delighted to have you all with us in person or online in Evanston or Washington or wherever you're joining us from, and just delighted to be co-hosting this conversation with the Women's Majlis series, which is an initiative of Executive Women at State, a State Department employee organization advocating for gender equality. And we have the leader of that organization with us today. Our mission here at Northwestern Buffett is to foster meaningful engagement against boundaries and borders of all kinds. And today we're going to be talking about national borders and also gender barriers and how we climb over or sometimes plow through both of those. So we have some wonderful, wonderful colleagues with us today. I just woke up this morning just so excited to be part of this conversation, thinking I'm going to be with some, as someone who worked in the Pacific, I said to my husband, I'm going to be seeing some chiefly women today, some real chiefs. We have with us some diplomatic trailblazers, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to be with you ladies on this panel. So immediately to my left is Ambassador Susan Jacobs. Ambassador Jacobs is the former U.S. ambassador to Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. She also served as special advisor for children's issues at the U.S. Department of State from 2010 until her retirement in 2017. And she was one of the very first married women to join the State Department in 1974. So a real trailblazer. So delighted you're here. To Ambassador Jacobs' left is Alison Dilworth. Alison Dilworth is a Foreign Service officer with more than 20 years of experience serving in countries including Paraguay, Israel, Egypt, Poland, and the United Arab Emirates, excuse me. She has recently been appointed Deputy Ambassador to Riyadh and will soon be representing our country in that very challenging position. So congratulations on that, and just thrilled that you will be playing that role. She's also Managing Director of U.S. Department of State's Office of Overseas Citizen Services and President of Executive Women at State, which is co-sponsoring this event. So thank you so much for bringing this conversation to Northwestern and for all that you do. It's great to have you. And now to her left is Consul General Beatriz Vivas. So just thrilled to have you with us, Beatriz. Beatriz has spent decades working in the Foreign Diplomatic Corps and now serves as Argentina's Consul General here in Chicago. She's a lawyer by training. She has held all kinds of diplomatic posts at the UN and various capitals around the world. And we're so thrilled that her current post is Chicago, where she's just bringing so much energy and positivity and creativity to that role and just enlightening and just giving Chicago new sparkle. So we're so thrilled that you're here. And last but not least, to her left is Monica Eppinger, Professor Monica Eppinger. So Monica served as a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv until 2001. She subsequently has been advising on U.S. policy towards Ukraine in the former Soviet space, and other advocacy and advising work. But currently, she is also a law professor. Her main position is as a law professor at St. Louis University, where she teaches subjects in the international law sphere and in property, and also the anthropology of law. She's trained as an anthropologist as well as a lawyer. So thrilling to have you, Monica, and especially to help us think about the intersections between the diplomatic and academic spaces in this conversation. So really happy you made it. Thank you. All right, so this is really exciting. So let's get started. Thank you all. And to our audience, if you're online, there should be a chat box and you can put your questions in there. Please do put questions, and someone will bring them to us by the power of the relationship between the virtual and the real. A piece of paper will appear, and we will ask your questions. So please do. And of course, to our audience here, please feel free to ask questions as well. All right, so let's get started. So, ladies, so we've all heard the maximum, a well-behaved woman seldom makes history. And you are all trailblazers, you're boundary breakers, as we like to say here at Buffett. And we know that boundary breakers and trailblazers rarely take the traditional path. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about something in your own individual journey where you have had to think creatively about the path to take, or have taken a different road than perhaps the normal road, and how that has paid off for you. So maybe just let everyone say a couple words. Let's start with you, Ambassador Jacobs.
First, I'd like to say how happy I am to be here with all of you today, and we look forward to your questions afterwards. I think that as a woman joining the Foreign Service in 1974, which up until then had been primarily a white male enterprise, you had to figure out how you could make a difference and not be considered a shrew or a threat to the men. And so my path was to be constructive, to give praise in public, criticize in private, and to try to promote new ideas and new thinking. And, you know, whether it was how to better organize a counselor section or how to get people together to solve a problem. So that's what I did. Show up and speak out.
That's great. Great advice. Alison, what would you say?
So when I joined the State Department in 1997, it unfortunately wasn't all that less male or white. It was still pretty much those things. And I was worried because when I first joined, I didn't see any role models or anyone that looked like the person I wanted to be and was in a senior position. So I did see a few women. I hadn't met Ambassador Jacobs yet, and so I had never met a woman in a senior position at the State Department who was married or had children or had an outside life other than the job, right? That was not what I wanted out of my career. And so I was a little nervous. But I did meet them along the way and was lucky enough to have many of them be my mentors and sponsors through my career, including this amazing woman to my right. And my non-traditional piece was that I was also married to a Foreign Service officer, still am. And so I took a winding path through my career. I did many of the traditional things that Foreign Service officers do in order to advance, but I did them in strange orders. I went to different places. I didn't specialize in one area. I went all around the world. And that was because I needed both a career enhancing job and a place for my husband to work. So it was part of the deal. And I knew that would mean I would advance up the ladder more slowly, but I didn't mind. And I still have had an amazing career, and I will be the deputy ambassador in Saudi Arabia this summer. So it hasn't hurt me, but it was a longer path. And I think that was absolutely tied to my gender and the decisions that I wanted to make to have a family and a life outside of the State Department, but it's also made my life more rich. So I'm happy to have done it.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Annalise, for organizing this panel. I'm really very happy to share it with you. And I see, yes, and I see some common grounds because also when I joined the Foreign Service, there weren't many women diplomats. And I also did the best I could. As you just tell that there are always prices to be paid. So you do it maybe slower than a colleague male, but here we are. And now in Argentina, there are much more women in diplomacy. So I think that it's getting better from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Monica, and I joined the Foreign Service in 1992. So 5 years before President Dilworth. And when I joined, my first overseas posting was a small consulate in northern Nigeria. And all of the State Department officers at that consulate were women. As far as I know, it was the only all-female post in the world. And so it was not I would have picked it if I'd been given the choice, but you're not given a choice much at that stage in your career. But I got lucky that the non-traditional part, one of the non-traditional parts of my path was that my very first post was all women. And we can talk maybe more with some of the future questions, but that was a great experience. So I would say that's the one I would go with.
Say a little bit more. How was it different, do you think?
Well, so this is anticipating another question that may be coming, but in terms of challenges to being a woman in the diplomatic service, one of the challenges, as I was reflecting before coming here today, one of the challenges that as I would articulate it, is the assumption within the US State Department that foreigners are more sexist than they are, and that we are less sexist than we are. And so before I went to post, they have you often do a round of consultations in Washington where you're talking to people from different agencies who have equities in that area, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, something like that. You also may meet with people who have served in that post before. And so I met with a consul general who had just come from that post. And he was talking about the person who had rotated into his position. He wasn't aware that everyone at post was going to be female. He was just talking about the leader of the post being female. And he said, this is a terrible mistake. It will hobble the United States. It's bad for US interests because Nigerians, this is northern Nigeria, this is a Muslim part of an African country. They are so sexist, they will not meet with her. How he knew that, I have no idea. But it turns out that if you're all women at post and you represent the United States government and somebody wants to talk to the United States, they're talking to women. And they did. The difference for us was that twofold. I'm not sure if that colleague's description of the Nigerians had been correct, and I don't think it was, but if it had been correct, then maybe if there was a junior male officer, people would have turned to that person and undermined the authority of the senior women. I don't know that. But there was no other person, and that worked for us. The other thing that I saw when I was there, I didn't experience sexism from Nigerians, but I did live in a part of the country where the upper class, the elite, often practiced seclusion. They practiced sex segregation of social life. So women had their sphere, men had their sphere. It turned out that if all of the diplomats serving the United States government are women, women get invited to the men's sphere, and we also get invited to the women's sphere. And the women's sphere was incredibly important. That's where the large-scale, multi-million-dollar, actually hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropy was organized through the women's sphere. The prior men at post had never had any insight into that world. They were never invited. They didn't know it existed. So we got to be honorary men, and we got to be biological women and social women. And I don't think that men transferred across those boundaries, and I don't think that they realized that half the world was hidden from them.
That
so
is
it was an asset.
So interesting. Okay, I think we have to take this up and hear about this in another place. So, Alison, I want to ask you about the Women's Majlis project because I think this sort of connects. Can you talk a little bit about that project, and perhaps have you seen some of the same experiences that Monica's describing here?
Yes, it was really striking to me when you were speaking the commonalities because I've served most of my career in the Middle East, and again felt very much like an other, not a man, not a woman, but invited many times to the events that all men were at, and then again the events where it was only women. And so together with my colleagues from the British and the Australian and the New Zealand embassy in Abu Dhabi, my last posting, where I was the economic counselor, we created the Women's Majlis. And anyone who has been in the Middle East knows a majlis is a gathering of men, typically, very late at night usually, and over a shisha pipe where you talk business. And it's very much like the old idea of a men's lounge where you have the cigar after dinner, right? And a great deal of business is concluded in the Majlis. And so the women that I was serving with had also served the Middle East, and they said, what if we created a Majlis that was specifically created by women and for women? And it was not exclusionary in any way. We always invited our male colleagues. In fact, we had a very specific Majlis that talked about male allyship, which is incredibly important. You can't have the conversation if you're missing half of the population. But we did create it, and just creating the term women's Majlis, just calling it that, made an impact, had a difference. And we thought for the first session, we would have maybe 20 people show up. We would call that a success, but we had 40. And then the second time we had 90. And then it rapidly grew so large that before COVID, we had to rent out ballrooms because we would have 200 people come because they were so interested in this concept. And so we started to sort of build upon that and also make it not only a place for advocacy for gender issues, but a place for networking for female diplomats. And again, we were sort of tapping into that concept of the men always spoke to each other and always brought each other up and said, you know, I'll sponsor you, I'll mentor you. We need to create a space where the women will do that. And I feel greatly indebted to the women who came before me in the State Department and in diplomacy. And so now I feel like that's my job too. And so the Women's Majlis was a space where we could do that.
Really exciting, really exciting. And so, Ambassador Jacobs, what about being the U.S. ambassador in the Pacific? Because there you were literally a top person representing the United States. What was that experience like? Do you think that, I mean, back to this point Monica's making, that there's a perception that, oh, it'll never work because they out there are sexist. They're more sexist than we are. And so they won't recognize a woman ambassador. Was that your experience?
Totally to the contrary. I was accepted from the moment that I got there. They knew that I was excited to be there, that I was open to meeting with everyone that was interested in talking about common issues. And just by showing up, I was invited to something that had to do with shipbuilding. I was like, okay, I'll go to that. Or they asked me to talk about rural health. And the idea is to try to find a commonality between what we do in the United States and what can be necessary in a country like Papua New Guinea with limited network ability through the internet and no roads and, you know, limited connectivity. And so we talked about rural health and how do you do this? And it was great. And they'd say, well, could you come and talk to kids about leadership? Sure. You can look up anything on the internet now and be an instant expert. And so it's really easy to give a speech. And there's all kinds of information about the American government on the internet and lots of ideas on how to do this. And I think what's important is to be accessible and not to be exclusive. And if somebody needs something, to talk to them and figure out what they need and how you can help them get it. So we had a lot of Fulbright and Marshall scholars and others in Papua New Guinea. They'd never met each other. So we did some research and we found out who everybody was and we invited them to a reception. And then they could all get together and build on what they had learned in the United States to help their country. I think that it was harder to do that in the Solomons and in Vanuatu because we weren't there. And also Vanuatu didn't really have a functioning government and neither did the Solomons. So, you know, you'd go to the prime minister's house and he'd greet you in his bare feet, but that was fine too. And you just had to, you know, like keep working on these issues and be open to whatever everybody needed.
Interesting. And Beatriz, let me ask you, how do you think that you are perceived here is it relevant that you're a woman? And do you find that Americans have any assumptions about how gender works in leadership in Argentina, how it's different, and how do you navigate all that?
I think that we all have assumptions for many things. So It's hard to make a general answer, but yes, I don't feel that my job is better or worse because I'm a woman, because I think that it's very different. This moment that for example, when I joined the Foreign Service, and I also think that it's very important for us the commonality that Ambassador Takeoff was mentioning. It's like when you do all the cultural translation, that is not words translation, that is not language translation, it's the mindset. And the mindset, it's different and it needs translation. And that's one of the main things that foreign diplomats we do. And we do translate since we are born. So we have some kind of gymnastics on that. And I think that we can add something to any conversation. So that's my answer.
Well said. It's very creative and challenging work, and also not always visible work, right? People think, oh, that was just translated. I know what that means. It just happened. Monica, I want to ask you about Kyiv, because you were posted at Kyiv, and you were there at a very interesting time. I believe you were there during Chernobyl, right?
I was there
Right
after Chernobyl. After Chernobyl. But I was the embassy's liaison to the parliament when they were writing their constitution.
Interesting.
So it was a part of the post-Soviet transformation process. And my job was to do that translation, to try to make friends with people in parliament, learn what they were putting in their constitution and what they were leaving out and in what order and why, and then try to report it back to Washington so that Washington wouldn't draw the wrong conclusions. So that translation. And my job really was to scoop the New York Times. My job was to try to find out what was going to happen in Parliament before Washington read it in the newspaper and came to some weird conclusion. And so, and then also to be a conduit back to Washington if the Ukrainians asked for specific questions, specific expertise, if they wanted some comparative expertise in how do you organize elections or independent judiciary, or you name it. The Constitution has a lot of stuff in it. So that was So the time that I was there was at a particular moment in state formation, and how that might relate to today and the war in Ukraine today. You heard it here first, and hopefully you'll see it in a law review article sometime soon. In my opinion, the unsung hero of the current war is the Ukrainian parliament. The United States government found it much easier to work with an executive branch, with a strong executive. And at least what people in the region tell me now is that the distinct impression in Moscow was that the United States, when Russia was forming its post-Soviet constitutional order, the United States wanted a strong executive so that economic reforms could happen quickly, so that there would be one person to deal with, one person in charge, one person who could give orders that would be followed. And when I was dealing with the Ukrainians and they were setting up their constitutional order, there was a strong wariness of executive power by the members of parliament that were drafting the constitution. And they were paying very close attention. This was in 1996. They were paying very close attention to what was happening at the very same time across the border to the north of them in Belarus. It was the year that the Belarusian opposition parties were outlawed. It was the year that a stronger executive branch figure was consolidating power. And so they were, in Ukraine, in Kyiv, the parliament was saying, we don't want the Belarusian variant. We want a parliamentary system. We want a legislative power that can balance the executive. And I think for that reason, by the end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s, it became a cliche. Even when I was on my Fulbright after I left the Foreign Service, I was back in Kyiv on a Fulbright. People who were there would talk, by people I mean Americans, diplomats or consultants that were coming on the US government's dime, would talk about Ukraine fatigue. They would talk about Ukraine muddling through, that there was always one step forward, two steps back, that you could never get anything done fast. It was always these endless debates in parliament. Well, guess what? When you get a strong executive figure, it might be easier for us to deal with. But if there's an internal faction, for example, the intelligence services that want to play capture the flag, it makes it very easy for there to be, for the intelligence services, as in Russia, to take over that one position. So my sense is in what's saving Ukraine right now is the fact that they did muddle through in the 90s and that they don't have, or until the war started, they didn't have a strong executive system. And it was the parliament who really held the cards. And it took longer to get things done, but it allowed a lot more space for innovation. So that was my period in Ukraine, was during that period of state formation. And that's what got me hooked enough to leave the Foreign Service and go back as an academic.
Thank you. It's interesting. I couldn't help but resist asking you about that, given that it's so much in the news now. So coming back to our theme of women's inclusion at state, Alison, could you talk a little bit about Women at State? What Women at State is trying to do? What are some of the key issues on the agenda? What do you see as your objectives? What are the barriers you're trying to address?
Happy to. So again, when I joined, and I didn't see these role models, that was something that I really wanted to work on. So I joined Executive Women at State, and at that time we were 3 different organizations, because again, the focus was on networking. So we were a sort of a junior women organization, and then a mid-level, and then a senior level. But at some point we realized that we needed to combine those into one Executive Women at State with the purpose of gender parity at all levels throughout the State Department, and that we could be a real force for advocacy by doing that. And that's when I think we really started to have both a voice at the State Department, but also a partnership with the Secretary. And we have had excellent relationships with all of the secretaries at the State Department. But right now, I would say we have one of the best working relationships that we've ever been able to have, and that has given us a real voice to do good work. And so, most recently, we were able to implement both maternity and paternity paid leave, which is kind of silly that it took that long, but we finally were able to achieve that. Real feedback on 360 evaluations that happen at the State Department for both men and women, but to include that piece that is often missing, where there might be gendered language, or there might be sort of a gender twist on an evaluation. We were able to get more clear and transparent feedback, which was extremely helpful. So these are all little pieces that we work towards with Executive Women at State every day. And what we're working on now, more than anything, is sort of 2 areas. And the first is the lack of senior women, and trying to explain why, trying to figure out the why. And for that, we're really doing a deep dive on data. So that sort of feeds into the second piece, which is an office that we've convinced the Secretary Blinken to authorize, and he has, which we're very grateful for, to look into why women at the department are staying and why they're leaving, and at what levels, and the why. So when you have that data set, you can actually draw some conclusions and take some actions to remedy the situation, because we do know for sure there's a lack of women still at the senior levels, but we don't know the why. And we think there's a lot of self-selecting out that women do for lots of various reasons. And so my organization focuses on sponsorship programs, mentorship programs, trying to encourage women to get over imposter syndrome, to avoid the glass cliff, to all of the things that you read about in all of the articles, that they should put themselves forward for these positions. Because they don't. But we really are doing that deep dive into the data to figure out why, and I'm excited to see what the next year will bring in that space. But having that large group, we have 1,800 members, and hello to many of them who are listening right now. But I do hope that breadth and depth that we have at the State Department will allow us to not only achieve gender parity, but advocate for women on gender issues at the department. And so that's what we try to do every day.
I think that's a remarkable achievement. When I joined the Foreign Service in my incoming class, there were 12 women and 10 of them left within 5 years. So it would be really interesting to find out why people were leaving. You know, and I asked my daughter, who was very interested in joining the Foreign Service, signed up for the exam, took the exam, passed it. And I said, so when is your interview? And she said, I'm not going to go any further because it seems to me that women either join because they're not married or they, and they want to get married, or, you know, that they want cats. So she,
That's hilarious.
but, so she's a lawyer and she decided to stay at home. But I wanted to add what Alison said. I think that you can have a fulfilling career in the Department of State and raise a family. My husband and I raised 3 kids overseas. We were both in the Foreign Service. And if you ask my kids about their childhood, I know they will say that they loved every minute of it because they got a lot of our time and attention. But at the same time, they were encouraged to explore the countries that we lived in and to be independent and to have friendships around the world. And because of the internet, they are still in touch with kids that they went to elementary school with, even though from 40 different countries.
Incredible. Well, I think that's a good point. And I wonder, you know, we have some students here with us in person, a number of students watching online who are thinking, I'm curious about all this. Is this for me? Is it not for me? Should I be considering this? What advice would you have to those women or gender nonconforming persons who might be interested but not sure? And what advice would you have if they decide to do it about how to succeed? Because you're all incredibly successful. So what do you think? You start us off, Ambassador Jacobs.
Okay. I think it can be a great career. I think it is exciting to live overseas, to learn about new cultures, and to represent your government overseas, and to show them that America is more than whatever they're reading about in the newspaper. So I would encourage people to do it, but they need to do it with their eyes wide open. When we joined the Foreign Service, if you wanted to make an overseas phone call from Greece, you had to book the call in advance. I mean, doesn't that seem silly now? So really now it's much easier to stay in touch with your families. I mean, you can call them on Skype or WhatsApp or just, you know, spend a lot of money and dial direct. But it's possible. But you do miss out on things. But I think it's more than compensated by the families that you build overseas with other people in the embassy, with people in the country that you're representing, that you meet and celebrate with. And I think it's great. My kids went to international schools. They got a great education for the most part. I mean, there were gaps, but that's okay. I'm sure there are gaps in American schools. But what I like is the openness that they have to meeting new people and the responsibility they show to their country by volunteering their time and just being wonderful human beings. I think it's great. I think, though, when I joined the Foreign Service, people saw it as a very long-term career. In one capacity or another, I served for 42 years in the Department of State. People don't do that anymore. So it's worth it to give it a try. And if you hate it, then you leave. And it doesn't disqualify you from finding another great job like Monica has shown. But if you love it, you can succeed. And you have to, I think, whether you're a man or a woman, you have to pick your battles carefully. You have to show up, you have to volunteer, you have to be open to everything. I was a school board chair in 2 different countries. I ran a commissary committee. I ran the review committee. People said, like, Susan, you control my life. And I said, you're right. So be nice to me. Because if you're not, we will not carry your favorite food in the commissary. But it's it can be very rewarding, sometimes frustrating, but you're serving your country, and I think that that's really important.
Well said.
So, one of the reasons why I'm passionate about executive women at state and so honored to be the president is that I believe that more women should be in the senior ranks. So this is a cause that is very near and dear to my heart. I also believe that the State Department should represent what America looks like, and it doesn't right now. We're working on it. We're getting there. I would say that the State Department is a gigantic ship that turns very, very slowly, but it does turn in the right direction. It just needs lots of people to help it turn. And as a president of an employee organization, I have met the other presidents of other employee organizations at the State Department, and it is a welcoming place now through many, many changes and through advocacy by many, many different groups for people of all genders, for non-conforming gender, for every type of individual. What we need now is for more of those individuals to put themselves forward for senior positions. So that's sort of why I'm passionate about it. So my advice would be absolutely to put yourself forward, to give it a try. I'm going to differ from Ambassador Jacobs just a little bit, and that I want you to stay because I want you to become a senior person in the State Department. We need more people to stick around and be those policy changers at the senior levels. So that's something that we work on very, very closely, executive women at state. But it does come with price, right? It does come with sacrifice. You are serving your country, and like many of our colleagues in the military, we have we share the same sacrifices. You are away from your family for long periods of time. You are in dangerous parts of the world. It didn't really occur to me until I came back from Jerusalem that my children went to school every day with an armed guard. Those things do have an effect on a family over time. But again, my children also got to see, the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall when they went to school every day. They got to see the pyramids in Egypt. I mean, how cool is that? And they learned about cultures and our world in a way that I don't think you do if you are just in your home country. So for me, absolutely worth it. But I would say if you do go into it with your eyes open, it's an incredible experience.
Thank you. And Beatriz, what would you say? And I would say, one of the things that's unique about you on this panel, among other things, is that I believe you're the only member of the group who has served as a diplomat at a multilateral institution, right? So you have yet another experience there. So what are your thoughts?
I think that's part of the conversation we have. We all tried. The good thing about diplomacy is that you have very different areas. You can serve in a multilateral, bilateral, consular, and you can adjust that to your requirements of your personal life, because I do agree with Alison that you are not well balanced if you are 100% in one side, any side. So you need everything. You need a good work, you need to have a family and private life. So that's what I did. And I think that it's very interesting that at the multilateral level, also women have been more protagonist. But still it's true, at the top level, they're mostly men yet. And even though at the beginning it's more equal. So what I am amazed in this conversation is to see how much we have in common. So it doesn't matter where are you, the foreign service from, but we are seeing that we are improving and there is a lot of work to be done, and we have to do it because nobody's going to do it if we don't engage. So it's very interesting, and multilateral is as much as you can be completely invested, and you can also, there are different commissions. It all depends. There are many options. That's the only thing that we don't see at first sight, that diplomacy has a lot of very different jobs.
Thank you. And Monica, what advice would you give? You're the only member of the group here who has jumped ship and gone in another direction.
I did.
And that also means that you can give us an interesting perspective on the similarities and differences of gender and leadership in the university context and in the diplomatic context. So what would you say?
First of all, if anyone's interested in serving in the diplomatic service, definitely do it. Diplomacy is inherently an optimistic profession. We think the world can be better. And there is a unique position in any country's diplomatic service, and I would say with the United States in its position in the world, a unique position to make the world a better place. That is something that many professions try to make the world a better place. Doctors, teachers, professors, but in the diplomatic service, you can make big structural things better just by talking. And there are many parts of the US government, it's an honor to serve your country. There are many parts of the US government in which you get to serve your country, but to get to serve your country in the cause of peace is unique. And that is something that I never took for granted. It was an honor every day to serve. I loved every day of it, and I would suggest it to anyone. So that's the first thing I would say. In terms of advice I would give to people, if you're interested in it, definitely go for it. If you're an American citizen, state.gov, that's where you find out how to take the test. You take a test, personal statement plus written test if you pass, oral exam, if you make the cut, then you're off to the races. So it's a meritocracy. You don't have to have certain degrees. You don't have to have certain number of languages. You don't have to have lived abroad. So go for it if you're interested. That is something that I strongly suggest. Comparing it to universities, this may surprise my colleagues, but I found the State Department, even when I was not in an all-female post, I found the State Department to be deliberately egalitarian in its procedures. The bureaucracy is bound by federal law, and it tries. And so there's always room for improvement, but compared to universities, which we think of universities as a meritocracy, but it turns out in my experience and in my observation that there's a lot that has to do with informal networks, relationships, old boy paths. Where I went to law school after I left the Foreign Service, I went to Yale Law School, and there was an organization called Yale Law Women that surveyed our professors about classroom conduct and tried to suss out implicit bias. And the professors, to a person, were, yes, we believe we are gender blind, and we believe that men and women are equal. There's no difference in ability. Yay, yay, yay. And then when you asked, when people would sit in class and look at who a professor called on, they called on white men. If you asked professors in a survey, can you name 3 former students that you have had contact with within the last 5 years? Regardless of the professor's gender, they had kept in touch with male students and not female students. Women become invisible. I did not feel invisible in the State Department. I represented my country. When I went to the Parliament, I wasn't a woman, I was a US diplomat. And that was an incredibly empowering experience to have in that period of my life. I think it changed my life for the better. And I think if I'd gone into academia first, it could be grinding you down. And I think that I train students that are going into the profession of law right now, and I'm not sure that law has it much better. So I think that the State Department it's got problems, and I really love the work that you're doing and appreciate it and applaud it, and it still is better than a lot of alternatives.
Wow, what a positive note.
Thank you.
That's great. Yes.
I loved it.
So now it's time to hear from all of you. So let's take questions or comments. Just ask that you identify yourself. And do we have microphones? Great, just say who you are. And
Hi, I'm Blythe McGarvey. I grew up in the business world. And as you probably know, you can change jobs a lot. And sometimes you're at the top of a position and then you get moved into a chief executive or chief financial role or what have you. My question to you is, I have actually 2. The first one is that even possible in the State Department that if you started off in law, let's say, and now you're 40 and you want to go into the State Department, will they even take you laterally? Or, France, we have the enarchs, and then they become chairman of a company. So they don't even come up the ladder. They just move straight from politics in. So I'm wondering about people that are 40 and above, if there's ever an opportunity to move into the State Department. And my second question is, I'm also curious, what was the most challenging crisis each of you have had to deal with in your career? Because there's always crisis.
I can start. So yes, you can enter the Foreign Service up to a certain age. There is a cutoff age because we have mandatory retirement at 65 right now. But you can't always enter at the level that you might be at in your current career. So as we were saying before, it is a meritocracy, and so you come in at a certain level and you earn your way up the ladder, so to speak. And I like that because all Foreign Service officers do 2 tours overseas at the start of your career on what we call the visa line. And you can do various other projects while you're doing that as well. But for a certain period of your day, every day, you were doing visa interviews. And I love that because I think that that is really the face of the US government to most of the world. Most individuals overseas only ever meet a consular officer at a visa window when they're asking for their visa. And so if you can learn how to give difficult messages and say no to some people and still have them feel like you respected them, and if you can welcome into our country the individuals who should be, that's an important skill to learn. And it's an important way to learn how to represent the government. So I like that we do that, but I do feel like past that point in time, we might not take advantage fully of the expertise that might be out in the private sector that we could pull into the State Department. Is a difficult thing to do because how do you assess, what level someone is at, and especially how do you fit that into our organization? Crises, oh my gosh, there's so many. I just ran our task force on Ukraine and can say, from the Washington side, and can say without a doubt that the US government spent every resource that it had to protect American citizens during this conflict, and that made me so proud. The overnight shifts where we were there at 2 a.m. getting newborn babies across the border, would make anybody tear up, and if you don't, you're not human. We did amazing work in there, but I think I probably would say I evacuated Americans out of Gaza, out of Egypt out of Gaza into Egypt as a fairly young officer, and stood at the border in an ill-fitting flak jacket and helmet that the Marines had given me because there was active shooting, and got 80 Americans to safety in Cairo. That's something I will always be proud of, never forget. And if I ever get to be an ambassador someday, it will still pale in comparison to being able to get those people to safety. So I would say. What was your crisis?
I didn't have to deal with too many crises, which was good. There was an attempted coup in Papua New Guinea, but we were mostly observers. I know, but what I could do was reassure the Prime Minister that, we stood by the rule of law and that if they needed anything, just to let us know. But I served on a lot of task forces where we were trying to help American citizens who were in danger, starting with the sinking of the Andrea Doria and other things like that, where you were having to call people and tell them that their relatives have died. I think that is one of the hardest things in the world to do. And that is a job of consular officers. And Alison talked about being on a visa line. My advice to junior officers who complained about issuing visas was think about the questions you can ask and what you can learn about the country by asking those questions. You can learn an awful lot. What are people living on? How are they making their lives? What are they doing? right now, it's much easier to be a political officer because you can basically read a lot of it in the newspapers. But if you really want to know how people are living, be a consular officer and talk to them, talk to the people on the line. And you have to learn how to say no as nicely as possible and how to say yes right away. I mean, you're given like 3 minutes to do a visa interview. If somebody walks up to your window and it's a business person who is going to the United States to buy or sell something and they look reputable and they sound reputable, issue the visa. If they don't, talk to them and try to find out why not. And that is a very hard lesson for a lot of young officers. And so it's really important to go over why they issued and why they didn't issue. And I remember somebody complaining to me about a visa that was not issued. And I said, were they treated politely? And he said, oh, yes, they were very polite. And I said, then, my work is done. I mean, what I am interested in is how is somebody treated? And if they're treated well, then that's a decision. And it doesn't mean you can never come to America. It just means at that particular moment, you can't come. In Israel, I had somebody who was applying for the 27th time in about a month. And I said, why are you here today? What is different? And he said, I thought today would be my lucky day. And it's like, you got to admire that, but it was still no. But where did we start this?
Beatriz, what about you? Have you had any experience with crises?
The pandemic, the borders were closed. Suddenly, the tourists and everybody who was here couldn't go back home. That was a crisis. And well, we did the best we did, not as fast as we wanted, but everything went okay. So that was a crisis.
There's nothing better than making a crisis seem just boring, right? That's what we're going for. That means you did your job well. It's all okay. What about you, Monica? Did you experience any crises?
A bunch. The first one that came to mind was Labor Day weekend of 2000. I was posted to Washington, D.C. I was on one of our desks in the West Africa Bureau. I was responsible for 3 countries and an international organization. That means I was responsible for the U.S. relationship with those countries. And one of those countries was the country of Guinea. And I got back to the office after Labor Day weekend. And what I had waiting for me were cables from the ambassador saying that there were reports from the border of Guinea that troops sponsored by the regional villain, I think it's not, it's Charles Taylor, if anyone's familiar with him. So Guinea is a country that's right next to a country called Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone had a civil war, and the troops that had so-called civil war, but half of the troops had been sponsored by the president of Nigeria, Charles Taylor. So Charles Taylor had sponsored troops in Sierra Leone. There had been a bloody civil war, the hallmark of which was when they invaded the capital of Sierra Leone, Freetown. They lined up all the men that they could find between the ages of 18 and 40 and cut off their right hands. So people in Guinea had lived next door to the country that had suffered that. And this particular Labor Day weekend, there were reports that those troops that were sponsored by that guy were invading the country that I was responsible for our relationship with. And there were 500,000 refugees from Sierra Leone that had resettled over the border in Guinea, and that were at risk because they had fled from the areas that had been previously attacked by this guy. And so my job was to try to work with our government and the government of Guinea to figure out, is there anything that we can do? And it turns, this was pre-9/11, so the one word that we got was, there will not be a single American life put at risk. Don't expect boots on the ground. Don't expect any military assistance. This is not going to happen. So is there anything that we could do? And there's a lot that you can do, actually, and sometimes with good offices and not much money. So we worked with the government of Guinea and the UN and got people relocated to the interior of the country and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that was a high point for me. That was a crisis. It wasn't a crisis for the United States, but it was a crisis for a country, the relationship with which I was responsible for. And the 500,000 people made it through the rest of my tour, at least alive. So that's my.
So we have a question from one of our online viewers. Could you talk a little bit about how you have managed being the public representative of your government when you may not agree with your government's policies? Anyone want to take that one? Yes? Okay. The retired ambassador will take that.
Retired ambassador, because I can speak truth to power. There were times when I did not agree with what my government was doing, and I just didn't talk about it. You know, people would ask, and I really can't talk about that right now. And you just find a way to avoid it. Generally speaking, I do usually, look, this was, I was an ambassador 20 years ago, and I thought we were doing a pretty good job. And so I didn't have a lot of disagreements with what we were doing. I think it was good that I retired when I did, because I think I would have disapproved with the way that we handled a lot of our foreign relationships. And so I would have had to retire anyhow, because you can't do it. I mean, there are dissent channels in the State Department where you can express your views about policies with which you do not agree. But generally speaking, not much is going to come of that, to be perfectly honest. And then, or you can resign, and then you can make a statement about why you're resigning. And I think that if you can't defend your country, then you shouldn't be serving. That's really what I think. And then you can go public with your views. But I did find it much easier to speak my mind after I retired.
But I also think that there is power in language. And I think that there have been many times where I have said, I'm here on behalf of the US government, and my government would like you to know X, Y, or Z. That doesn't mean I would like you to know that. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree with what my government is passing along as a message. But I'm a US diplomat. And again, as Ambassador Jacobs said, if there had come a moment where it had been too difficult for me to represent my country overseas, I would have resigned. But I never had that moment. I'm not going to say every day as a diplomat is easy. There are moments that challenge you, but that's why you took the job. If you want to be a diplomat, you're going to have to deliver difficult messages. Sometimes you're not going to like delivering them, but it's something that you do. And at that same time, I can represent the best of what America has. And having served overseas now in 5 different countries and about to head out to Saudi Arabia, I can say without a doubt that I believe that our government is the best government in the world, that our government has the best systems. Is it perfect? No, far from it. Do we have a long way to go in many areas? Absolutely. But I have seen other governments in action, and I would say any day of the week to anyone that we still have the best government, and that I'm proud to serve it. So I think, it's part of the job.
Candy Lee, I teach at Northwestern. The U.S. sort of balances between appointing ambassadors who have contributed to campaigns and ambassadors who deserve it, like you all. How do you feel in the State Department about this balance, and have you served for people who got there through patronage? And how do you feel about that?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that some political ambassadors are really good. They have country expertise. They can bring new ideas and a different way of doing things. And some are terrible because they feel entitled and privileged and don't care about the troops. But I also think it is up to the people at Post to help the ones that come in with a different attitude about what diplomacy is, to help them adjust their way of thinking and teach them that you can't just ride roughshod over what a country wants, that you have to be able to listen and do things. I had a wonderful ambassador in Romania who was a political appointee, but he was very short-tempered. And he gave a speech once and he took questions afterwards, and somebody asked him a question and he said, I don't understand what you're saying. So the person repeated the question and he said, I didn't say I couldn't hear you. I said I didn't understand you. And I gave him an elbow and and he said, oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you could restate your question. But he learned. And he learned that, he was a very high-powered lawyer in Washington, and I think somebody that really cared about what he was doing. But, maybe in a law firm, you're allowed to play favorites, and you can't really do that in an embassy. You have to treat everyone fairly. You have to listen to their views, and you have to have respect for the country that you are accredited to. And also, remember that you are representing the United States and we stand for certain things. And to send, somebody that is totally unprepared, that is doing this because they want another credential, I think is a disservice to the United States and certainly to the diplomatic service.
Yes, we have up to 25%. The law allows up to 25% political appointees. And I also have bosses, career diplomats, and also political appointees. And I can say that you have some that are really very good and others less good and others not good at all. So it all depends on the people. It's not, so my experience was that. And also, for example, in my case, as a career diplomat, I served for administrations A, B, and C. And I applied the same criteria that any of us in this room would apply when don't agree. If you really don't agree, well, I think you have to resignate a post. But if not, you have to try to find the logic, how to explain it, and how to, again, translate it. And also, for example, me as a consul general, I don't make political statements. That's up to the ambassador in DC. So again, diplomacy has many different phases.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Diplomacy has many different ways. Ladies, I just want to say each of you is absolutely inspiring in what you've achieved. Just the amount of leadership talent we have here on this panel is truly just remarkable. And I just really want to thank each of you for your service, for what you do, and for being with us here today and sharing your thoughts. And thank you.